Yeah. Okay. As you know, historians studying the past, professional historians in universities often go back to some books, some documents again and again. And in English history, to look at the structures of society, we use very often, everybody at Oxford University has to read it in their first year, a book by Sir Thomas Smith about the English Republic. It's got a Latin title called De Republica Anglorum, of the English Republic, and it's a description of power and rank and authority in England. So he describes society. He's probably copying a manuscript from somebody else as well at the time. A second document you use in England that we'll be looking at is more than a century later, and it's the figures of Gregory King, who was a first statistician, and I'll show you in a moment his figures for the numbers of people in different groups in society in England. So that's England, where everybody is familiar with those documents. In France, there's a book about the monarchy by someone, actually I could write his name up, but yeah, I will. Say so. He wrote a book called The Great Monarchy of France in 1515. And that's about power, and the other book about power that people read at the same time, two other books at the same time. One is by Thomas More called Utopia, and another one is by Machiavelli called The Prince. So they're all written at the same time. They're not completely about society, but there is stuff about things about society in them. But the main book for early modern France that people use for politics, people use not just Cecil, but they use another writer called Bodin, B-O-D-I-N, called Six Books of the Republic. And notice that they're not using the word monarchy, they're using the word republic, even in these monarchies. So they must think of power and of kings not as being really powerful. They must think of kings being at the service of the body politic, of the great chain of being, the hierarchy of orders and so on. So they don't have an idea that they have to obey automatically the king, and royal authority. They don't think that is complete. Okay, you can see that from the titles of the books and the notion of society. The book that people use, and has been used a lot in the debate over the kind of society you have, is by someone called Charles Loiseau, and I will write his name up. There we got it here. You can probably not read it, so I'll write it here. Well, so why? Charles Loiseau. Now he's a lawyer. And he writes a big book. He actually writes two big books. They're about this thick, in very small print. It's called A Treatise of Orders. So he writes about society and all the ranks and orders in it, okay? And one of the quotations we use, it's in your documents, Society of Orders handout documents, okay? So you have this quotation, but I'd like to read it to show you that what I said was true, okay? And he also makes a reference to the great chain of being in it. He also wrote a treatise of signories, or a treatise of lordships as well. So he wrote these two huge volumes, of his life's work, I guess, to try to kind of fix a description of society. This is what lawyers do. Lawyers want to nail down the meaning. They want to take the meaning and nail it to the blackboard and say, this is it. We can argue about this, but not that. This is it. Okay, and that's what he's doing in his book on A Treatise of Orders, which means that it may be more of a fixed description than society really is. So it gives you no movement, okay? It's a fixed description. Anyway, this is what he says. I hope you can understand me, but I'm doing some very intelligent things in this as well. So, there's more. If you were a graduate student, you would see more in what I'm saying. But I'm trying to, make it simple and still give you a good basis for understanding, a better basis than the textbook. So, he says, in all things there must be order. For the sake of decorum, that's for the sake of what is right, what is proper, and for their control, which he means for governing. So you can't govern and you can't have a society that seems right without order. He says inanimate creatures, that's creatures without spirit, like ants and so on, mice, dogs, whatever, are all set in their places, and trees and things as well, even stones. Inanimate creatures are all set in their places according to their high and low degrees of perfection. What does that mean? It's kind of referring to God, that God has given them a certain image. So essentially, the more they look like man or an angel, which is the image of God, the more perfect they are, because God created man in his own image. So this hierarchy is not just the way society is, but it's justified by religion. That great chain of being comes from God, remember. God created man, God created the angels, and then down. And so he says, interestingly, that the most perfect are at the top, and so a noble is of course more perfect than a peasant as well. So in the case of men who are ordained by God to command the other creatures in this world, like horses, dogs, whatever, women maybe he'd think as well, in the case of men who are ordained by God to command the other creatures in this world, their order may be subject to change. So he's actually saying that you can have changes of position. It's not completely fixed. We cannot live together in a condition of equality, but of necessity there must be some who command and others who obey. So we can't all be equal. You have to have people who are in charge and people who do what they're told. So order and God expect people in society to have authority. Right? Those who command, those with authority then, have several orders or degrees. So he's going to describe them. He says they have several ranks, orders or degrees. He's trying to find the words to describe them. So we have to, if we study literature, we think that people, when they're talking about new things, have to give words new meanings, or not just the old meanings to words. So he's saying in authority we have to recognize that they have several orders. This is his book, Treatise of Orders, or degrees, ranks, or hierarchy on the board. First of all, sovereign lords command all those in their states. That means people with sovereign power, that's ultimate power, top power, command people in their state. It's not clear actually what this means when it says in their state. I'm guessing because it's a translation. It's not clear that he means in the state. It's not clear that he thinks that the state exists. The state like the Chinese state today, the British state in the 18th century. He may be saying those who command, sovereign lords command all those in their estate. He may be meaning that those people command all those in this kind of grouping of different people, this society, He may not be referring to a set of institutions with law courts and taxation and so on that we call an estate. So it's hard to read this document, I noticed that for the first time, because I'm doing a talk about estate. Those addressing their commands to the great, so they give their commands to the great, and then the great give their commands to the intermediate, and the intermediate to the minor, that's the lesser people, and the minor, the lower people, to the people, by which he means the lower orders. So he thinks that there's a kind of chain of authority. But I don't think he really thinks that this is like a bureaucracy, where you have someone who's head of an office who tells someone to do it and so on. I don't think he thinks that at all, because nobody who works for a state in our period that we're talking about thinks about bureaucracy in that way. You know, bureaucracy hasn't been invented by Max Weber yet. That's so in the 19th century, or this state. So nobody thinks like a bureaucrat. You know, maybe they do in China, in the Chinese state and so on. But in Europe, remember, they own their function. They own the office of King's Secretary. So they're kind of independent. Everyone is independent from everyone else. So it can't be a chain of hierarchy of commands in the sense that we mean, where, you know, I tell you to write an essay, you tell your sister to write it for you, and so on, you know, like in a chain of commands. So it's not an easy document to understand. It seems easy. And the people who obey all of these are again divided into several orders of rank. So the people is that 90% of the population, what he calls the people, and 90% of the people, and they're divided up as well. So everyone is divided up. Some command, some have less commands, and so on. And then you get to the people, and they're divided up as well. And so by means of these multiple divisions, these multiple lots of divisions and subdivisions, one general order is formed of many orders. So that's like the picture of the great chain of being that I showed you, or the procession, right? So that through order, a very great number of social divisions still results in one unity. So he's doing two things here. What's he doing? One, he's stressing order and rank and hierarchy, but the other, he's stressing harmony and unity. So it's not a picture of conflict, right? Not at all. Okay, now I'd like to move on to thinking about to thinking about the Society of Orders and the clergy and so on. So I've explained about the shape of society. I've explained that it seems simple, but it is not as simple as you think. Why? Because why do I have to explain this? Well, I think maybe you have an idea that society is about conflict, so I think it's interesting that they think society is about harmony. Maybe you always, having come from a Marxist tradition, be looking for the origins of revolution and the origins of the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the bourgeoisie and so on. And that's actually not a good way to think about this society most of the time. And there are points when we can argue about this and say, yes, you know, maybe this is happening. And there is a transition from feudalism to capitalism, obviously. There is the rise of the state, which belongs or acts for certain social groups, of course. So it's not that some of these big changes don't happen. These big changes do happen. It's how we explain them. And so I'm trying to give you the tools to explain differently some of the important changes which really did happen. Okay, but maybe they didn't happen the way you were taught or I was taught, or the way historians believe now. We're finding more, and in 10 years or 20 years we'll have different explanations all the time. And that's why history is good, and that's why as school teachers maybe you have to keep reading history so that you don't get 40 years out of date when you retire. Now let me say a little bit about the clergy, first of all. This first order, then, is those who pray. And everybody in this society is Catholic at the beginning of the period, and after the middle of the 16th century, that's 1520s, 1530s, everyone is either Catholic or Protestant or Jewish. There are some Jewish communities all over Europe. There are, at the beginning of the period, there are Muslims still in Spain, but they're expelled by 1500 largely. And the Jews also are expelled and often go to the Ottoman Empire, actually. So the world is a religious Catholic world. And so it's logical that the first order of society is the church. Now the church is an institution which is not completely coherent. It has a pope in Rome who's the head of the church. and each state has cardinals who elect a pope occasionally when one dies, and archbishops and bishops. So in France there are something like 140 bishoprics. So these will be in a big town, or not a very big town. A lot of them go back to Roman times, actually, to the late Roman Empire. So some of them may have become smaller towns then. There are many bishoprics in these 300 German states, and in Poland, in Italy, Spain, and so on. So it's a very Catholic world, and we're not doing essentially cultural history today, but we see that our shape of society and our ideology is influenced by religion. Loiseau is describing a great chain of being there, isn't he, with God-given hierarchy. So the church is a landowner. It exists, of course, to save people's souls. So everybody is supposed to be Christian. They're supposed to go to church on Sunday. The church invents confession of their sins sometime in the Middle Ages, which becomes a means of kind of thought control as well. And the church is actually quite corrupt and quite unable to perform its proper function, because the priests are not trained, they're not educated. There are no schools for priests. There are no, we call them seminaries. There are no places. I mean, they're supposed to have a degree from the university, but they learn badly. Everything is in Latin. The church service is in Latin, so the peasants don't understand anything. Any more than most Muslims understand the religion in Turkey. I didn't realise that everything is in Arabic in Turkey. They don't speak Arabic in Turkey, so everything in the mosques is in Arabic, and they don't read the Quran because they're told not to read the Quran. Actually, they get it from the Imam. So there's the kind of comparison between the medieval Catholic Church and the modern Muslim Church, Islamic Church in Turkey, is quite striking, and it gives rise, of course, to the same level of ignorance about religion. And fanaticism, of course, in the modern world. Anyway, the Catholic Church then is something that you can talk about just in religious terms, about its mission, the way it controls society, but you can also think of it as an institution with a sociology, social structures within its power in society, and so on. So I'll try and do a little of both. In terms of theology then, it is a certain kind of Christian theology, which I won't try to explain. I'll just say that everybody is supposed to accept that through the church. In practice, in the villages, the priests just give sermons or little lectures about morality, because they're not educated enough to tell you really about the Bible. The church wants people to get married in church, but very often they don't. So the church has a struggle to get people to marry, and eventually the state lends its authority to the church and insists that people get married, maybe for inheritance reasons and so on. You have legal documents, for legal order. But anyway, people are dissatisfied with the corruption in the church, the way the church takes money for marriages and baptisms, takes 10% of people's produce, 7 to 15%, depending on where you are, of people's produce in the fields. So it's called the clerical tithe. That's one of the privileges of the church. So it takes people's, not money, their produce, in kind. That's to say, it takes the cows, the sheep, the corn in the fields, and then it sells it. The church has privileges in the community. It doesn't pay taxes, for example. It may give a free gift to the monarchy sometimes. So the church is very wealthy. And at the top of the church, there are bishops and archbishops and cardinals. Now, who are they, these bishops? Who do you think they might be? Any ideas? What kind of people might they be? Anyone? What kind of people might you guess? Well, they're going to be nobles, right? They're going to be the nobility. Now, a bishopric might bring in France, in revenue, 30,000 livres. A livre is the kind of money they have. It doesn't really matter what it is. 30,000 is a lot. A peasant might have 200 in a year. Okay, so 30,000 or 50,000. The richest ecclesiastical institution in France is the Abbey of Saint-Germain that you can visit if you go to Paris and you're on the Boulevard Saint-Germain. There's an abbey there, and that's the Abbey of Saint-Germain. And the revenue from that, the money produced for that every year in the 17th century was 250,000 livres. Remember, a peasant has maybe 200 in a year, or maybe 100. 250,000, right? That's 1 million times more than a peasant would live on. Okay. Now, who's going to have that? Well, one of the king's brothers, maybe, will be given the chance to be the abbot of Saint-Germain, and so on. So you can see that the church is a rich institution, and that the states use the church to reward members of the of the nobility for their loyalty. It's their natural right, in fact. So an archbishop, a cardinal, a bishop will be a member of the nobility. In France, at the time of the French Revolution, there was not a single bishop who was not noble. Okay, out of 140. Okay, they're all noble, right? And so the nobility uses the church. It kind of inhabits the church in all its upper ranks of the church. So a canon of a cathedral, that's someone helping out with the services and running a cathedral, or someone looking after the Queen's religious duties. It's called an almoner. I studied someone who became a cardinal later, and he started off as one of the almoners of the Queen in Versailles, and so on. These people are all nobles, maybe minor nobles, but of course it brings money, right? It brings an income. So you shouldn't think that all the nobility is rich and just living wastefully off their estates. They really want to be members of the church. So a noble family will send one son into the church, and maybe a daughter into the church. Why would you send a daughter into the church? Well, two reasons. One, if she's in one of the new religious orders in the 17th century, and lots are invented, women educating children, women looking after the poor, women doing charity work and so on. There are religious orders that are invented with the revival of the Catholic Church in this period. So they have an active role for the first time, because women in monasteries in the Middle Ages just prayed. They didn't do anything, right? So women like this. But of course they get paid money, or they get looked after. So that means that the father of the family doesn't have to pay money for them to marry somebody. Okay, it's called a dowry, like in Matanguer. Okay, no land is lost, no land is given away. So that's good. So if you have too many daughters, put them in the church, right? And you have to pay some money. You give a dowry to the church, in fact. But it's a good investment, really. If you have two sons, one may go into the church and one may go into the army. Or if you have three, maybe one buys an administrative office, like a judge or a financial official. Another one becomes a soldier in the army, a captain with his regiment, and another one goes into the church, and then one daughter gets married to somebody who also has an office, a judge or something like that. She has to marry someone of high prestige, and of course the daughter who goes into the church can't marry, and that saves you some money probably. So of your 5 children, one has married into the same level, and 3 have done 3 different things, all of which are the kind of things that nobles do, right? So they're kind of noble jobs. Yeah. So most of the wealth of the church, the money of the church, goes to the higher clergy, the bishops and the archbishops. The Archbishop of Strasbourg, which is kind of a German town, it's not yet French, let alone the centre of the European Union, has 400,000 livres, L-I-V-R-E-S, 20 to the English pound. So £2,000. That would be £2,000. That's a lot of money in those days. Plus an additional income from other sources. So he actually has more than £1 million. So these ecclesiastical positions give you a lot of money. The Archbishop of Durham and the Archbishop of Winchester and the Archbishop of Canterbury in England had incomes probably between £5,000 to £7,000, which is a lot of money in those days. Now the church is privileged, and it contributed very little to the finances of government, to running government. In France they make a contribution to the state which is called a free gift. They call it free because the church doesn't want to admit that it has a duty to pay money, because it's independent. It fulfills its duty by praying for society and by providing religion. The church also has what we call judicial privileges. Now the word judicial means to do with justice, so it has its own courts. So a member of the church gets tried by church courts. So there are tax courts, there are civil courts, and there are church courts in society. For everything to do with members of the church and to do with religion as well. Now, of course, the clergy is not very good at doing its duties. They're not very educated and so on. And the highest positions in the church are often held by people who only see the church as a means of getting money and status and advancement. You know, they want to go from one bishopric to one that brings more money, to one that brings them nearer to the court so that they can speak to the king, so that they can help their family by getting the king to do favours and so on. So they don't look at it in a very religious way. They want to in 1764, out of the 131 French bishops, but anyway, 40 of this number lived in Paris rather than in their towns where their church was. So, you know, that's a third of them nearly are living in Paris, spending their time at the court in Versailles rather than with the people that need them in theory. And they never gave their lectures, their preaching, and they never visited the local priests to make sure that they were doing their job properly and looking after the people in the parish. In fact, they often hold the priests in contempt. They don't respect the priests at all. This is what a French bishop says about the priests, like the one in Martinguer. He says, "I'm in the throes of visiting these teachers of the people. I'm visiting these teachers of the people. But these people, the priests, hardly understand any of the nice things one may say to them. They are coarse, that's to say vulgar, dirty and ignorant. And to enjoy the company of these mediators between heaven and earth, these representatives who deal between God and people, you have to be very fond of the horrible smell of garlic." So they're just ignorant people who eat garlic, you know, which is smelly. But of course, the lower clergy, the people, priests in the villages, are worried by the huge wealth of the rich. So the church has its divisions as well, and its antagonisms, you know, between the low and the high. And the lower clergy in 1789 in France will side with the Third Estate against the bishops and the nobles, because the bishops are nobles. The church then is a very rich institution. It owns maybe 15% of the land, something like that. It depends where you are in Europe for how much it owns, but it owns a lot, because in the Middle Ages, merchants who get rich feel guilty because they've been told that it is sinful, it is not good, hard to get to heaven if you deal with money. So they build churches in the areas that produce wool. Sheep, you know, sheep in England. They built a lot of churches that we call the wool churches. They built churches from the profits from the wool trade in the late Middle Ages, 1400s, they would produce wool and send it to Holland in the Netherlands, then over the sea, where it would be made into tapestries and so on. So the wool trade was important. They got rich, but then when they died, not only would they build a church, but when they died, they would often leave their property or some of it to the church. So the church is getting richer. In Spain, the church gets very, very rich, because Spain is, in the 16th century, very, very Catholic, and it becomes the most missionary, the most militant of Catholic states. And so the result is that the church gets richer and richer in the 17th century in Spain, which of course is very bad for the economy. You know, the church is not noted for its enterprise and so on. So the church owns a lot of land. The nobility maybe owns 20 to 30% of the land as well, and maybe the bourgeoisie, those people, well-dressed people at the top of the towns, they're buying land inside the towns, a courtyard, a house, and then a field outside, and then another field, and so on, and then eventually they have enough money to buy a landed estate which has a title with it, so they can call themselves, you know, Monsieur de, with like Bertrand de Rolls. She wasn't a noble, but that's maybe wanting to look like one. And so there's a phenomenon of the bourgeoisie which is getting richer, not necessarily from trade, sometimes from stealing money from state finances and getting legally money from state finances. They're getting richer and they're buying land, and so they are, you know, so the land ownership is really at least 50% of the land belongs to the church, the nobility and the bourgeoisie, and more. And so the peasants, as we will see tomorrow, are losing land in this period. They own less and less land, because when there's bad times, they have to sell land to survive. So there's the kind of bourgeoisification of the land, but also nobles are buying land too. So the peasants are losing. So the church is a rich institution, it's the first estate, and it's peopled by nobles. So, who are the nobles? I will talk for just another 5 minutes on the nobles, and then we'll have another little break. I want to look at some different notes. Why should we be interested in the nobles then? I mean, you're thinking, well, this is very boring. He's told me a lot about early modern society. Why do I need to know about the nobles? Well, one of the reasons is there are a lot of debates, arguments between historians about the nobles. There are debates about whether they are gaining power or losing power, whether the state is taking power away from the nobles, whether the middle classes are beginning to take economic power from the nobles as well. So for Marxist historians, the role of the nobility is as important as the role of the middle classes or the bourgeoisie, because if the bourgeoisie are rising, maybe the nobility is falling. Or maybe not. Maybe if economy is expanding, maybe the bourgeoisie can rise and not challenge the nobility. Maybe more wealth can create more bourgeois and still leave the nobles in power right through the 19th century, up to the First World War maybe, or maybe even to today. You know, so maybe you don't have to have the idea that the nobles have to decline for the bourgeois to rise, because if your cake is getting bigger, your cake of wealth is getting bigger, you can have more bourgeois and still have the nobles, who may also be getting more powerful. So there's a different historical model of change for you, that may be an interesting one. So there are a number of debates then about this, which I'd written down here somewhere on my so is the nobility rising, and who are they? Who are the nobles? Are they just a feudal class of nobles, or are there different groups in them? And actually there are different groups in the nobles, and education becomes very important, more important than fighting. So I'll talk about that. Secondly, then, is there a rise? So, who are they? Is there a new nobility as well? Is there a rise of nobility in the 16th century, even the 17th century? If so, how does it happen? And why does it happen? You should write down these questions maybe, because I won't answer them obviously. Is there a decline then? If there is no rise, is there a decline of the nobility? Marx told us, and lots of Marxist historians told us, that there was a rise of the bourgeoisie in the 16th century, which meant the decline of the nobility. Is that true? There's a debate, and they looked at counting sales of manors and so on. And there's a good article by Jack Hexter about that called, I think it's something about the myth of the rising bourgeoisie. And he says, he talks about class loyalty as well. He says it's very hard to feel unbounded loyalty to a group whose leading members are always trying to lead it. So he says there's no class consciousness because all the rich bourgeois want to be noble. So they're not very proud of being bourgeois, they want to be noble. So they're not class conscious. So maybe they're declining, we can think about that. And then, are they an open elite? Are they a caste? You see, this image of society that I was talking about suggests that everything is fixed. And the quotation by Charles Loiseau suggests that God has given an order which doesn't change, and he can kind of nail the positions of people. He says there's a little bit of change, but not much. Okay? But we come back to this question I asked at the beginning. How is it that you can have 2% of society that's nobles for 300 years if noble families, demographically, that's statistically, according to the figures, according to historical research, how is it they can remain at 2% if a family only lasts 7 generations? Now, a generation is 20 years, okay? So if a family lasts 150 years, how is it you can have 2% 300 years later? It doesn't work mathematically, does it? But we do have 2% at the time of the French Revolution, and we did have 2% in 1450 in some province in France, all over France. So that means that there must be new people coming into the nobility, right? So we have to look at that and say, how do they become noble? And when they become noble, do they bring in new values and new ideas, or do they adopt old noble values and old ideas? So does a bourgeois who becomes noble, does he stay bourgeois? Or does he, yeah, you're right, he doesn't, does he become noble? Does he not want to know his bourgeois relatives anymore? He's a new noble, and literature makes fun of them. Molière makes fun of them in the Bourgeois Gentilhomme, which is a famous play, you know, the bourgeois gentleman. He makes fun of the pretensions of the new noble, because the new noble often wants to be more noble than the old one, you know. He will send his son off to fight in the war to prove that he's really a military noble. He's not really, because he bought the office, you know, he paid for it. He didn't go and fight, and so on. So we have an interesting area of research about the nobility. So then there's an area of research about the nobility which is very much now, which is about the nobility and power in society. Because if the nobility remains there, or if it gets more powerful or declines, we have to ask questions about what is power in society, what is noble power. Why do we do that? Because a famous writer who writes about the nobility in Louis XIV in France, called Saint-Simon, the Duke of Saint-Simon, says that the nobility is cut out of power. So there's a kind of historical myth that the nobility in France was cut out of power by a king who chose bourgeois ministers and wouldn't allow them to have any real power. He just called them to his court to be ornaments, you know, the wives in pretty dresses and the kings in, the princes in with their swords and so on, but not doing anything real. Okay? But historians like me and my supervisor and other people studying the nobility have shown that in court society they didn't lose their power, because the court became a centre of the distribution of power. So being at court was not to lose your power. Being at court, but in the provinces, say, you used to command in the province, but now you go to court, but you have links with people who still command in the province, and other members of your family are there, and so on. So we now realise that the nobility, because of the court system, kings having courts, like your emperor had a court, that the court system protects the power and is a good environment for the power of the nobility. And let's face it, it's not a good environment for the power of the bourgeoisie or a financial man or something, you see, because you need to get people to speak for you to the king to get your debts paid and so on. So there are a number of reasons why looking at the nobility is more interesting than just saying society is divided into the three estates and so on. There are actually lots of historical arguments about the role of the nobility that we can answer by looking more closely at them. And so that's what I'm going to do after our break, to begin to look at that again. But let me end by this section by just saying, think about where we have nobles. Okay, I said at the beginning that in England you have quite few nobles because they have the concept of the gentleman. Okay, but what is a gentleman? We'll come to that in a minute. A gentleman is maybe owns land, maybe has culture as well, maybe has a legal education, maybe he knows how to fight, you know. But he's very like a noble, and some the lords in England, the very high nobles, they would be the highest nobility, like the Grand Dukes in Spain, or the Grand Dukes in the Low Countries, or in France, the Dukes and Peers. There are 47 of them in France. But you know, there are thousands. There are maybe 20,000 families of nobles in France. So there are probably, 5,000 gentlemen in England, but only a couple of hundred people with a title. All right. So, but nobility is a fundamental part of society from the Middle Ages in the Spanish Peninsula, in France, all the French provinces, in England, of course, with that modification, in the Netherlands as well, in the rich towns of the Netherlands, with all the cloth trade and wine trade and so on, merchant trades, and in Germany, where you have all of these knights of the empire, knights in the little states of Germany, these landowners with they all over. In Poland, there's the Polish nobility that elects its king. In Spain, sorry, not in Spain, in the south of Italy, you have the lords that have their lands and their nobles in Sardinia and in Sicily and in Naples and all of these areas of southern and northern Italy, in Tuscany and so on, in Venice as well, in Central Europe, in what's called Bohemia, which is the area of Czechoslovakia more modernly, Bohemia with Prague as the capital, and then Vienna, all of these German states, I've said, give you a society which is divided between clergy and nobility and the third estate, and these social divisions are quite similar. So we can look at the nobility in a European sense. We will recognise that there are differences between the nobilities in different areas, differences in lifestyles, and as you move towards Eastern Europe, serfdom has disappeared in the West, but as you move towards the East, the noble will be a lord of serfs on cultivating his estates, and they will almost belong to him. Not completely. That comes back in a second serfdom in Eastern Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, where they reduced to virtually the position of slavery in Eastern Europe. But towards the East, serfdom is more severe, and so a noble is defined more by that kind of characteristic than by the things that define a British gentleman or a French noble. Okay, particularly education may be very different for a French and an English person from someone in Eastern Europe or in Russia and so on. Okay, so there are differences that you have to pay attention to, but after the break, another 10 minutes, I'll explain then about who nobles are in general. So another 10-minute break, taking us to 5 minutes, 12-minute break, 5 minutes past 4. Okay? Thank you.